Oscars Monster Madness!
It's October again, and it's time to look at some of the most famous horror movies and their sequels. For the rest of this week, I'll be looking at the classic Frankenstein series produced by Universal Studios. The choice was simple. It's the first long-running horror franchise, it includes 8 films, and it crosses over with The Wolfman and Dracula. So that gives us the most monsters for our madness. The novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley was written in 1816 and published in 1818. It's been performed on stage and made into a short film by Thomas Edison in 1910. But it was the 1931 Universal film that made it as famous as it is to this day. Even the most minor things were changed. In the novel, Frankenstein's first name is Victor, but in the movie, it's Henry. In the novel, he has a friend named Henry, and in the movie, he has a friend named Victor, so they swapped the names around as if they want it to be as confusing as possible. In the novel, Frankenstein creates a monster without any assistance. The addition of a hunchback servant was something that was only imagined for the movie. Yet it's become a famous cliché. Lots of people assume the servant's name is Igor, but it's actually Fritz.
And this time we're ready. Hey, Fritz?
It wasn't until the third film, Son of Frankenstein, when there was a guy named Igor, and then it was spelled with a Y, not an I like most people imagine. I think it may have been the Mel Brooks parody Young Frankenstein that popularized the name Igor and made it synonymous with that of Frankenstein's assistant.
You must be Igor.
No, it's pronounced Igor.
Anyway, back to the differences with the novel. In the novel, after Frankenstein gives life to the monster, he is appalled by it and abandons it. In the movie, he's confident in his creation. It's all the other people who hate the monster. I guess it's best I back up and relay the plot. The movie begins in a gloomy cemetery with Frankenstein and Fritz stealing a freshly buried corpse. Next thing, they're cutting down the body of a hanged man. Frankenstein is planning to use the different body parts for his creation. An arm here, a leg there, a dick there, whatever. But it's the brain he's having the most trouble with. Frankenstein's former professor, Dr. Waldman, is teaching a class on the difference between a normal brain and an abnormal one. The class ends, and luckily they just leave the 2 brain specimens sitting there alone. Frankenstein seizes the opportunity and sends Fritz into the room to steal one of them. He goes for the normal brain first, but then drops it like an idiot, and then has to go for the abnormal brain, which is why the monster turns out the way he is. During a severe storm, he prepares to bring his creation to life. Dr. Waldman shows up at his door along with his friend Victor and his fiancée, whom he's been very absent-minded toward. At first he tries to shoo them away, but decides he might as well let them be witnesses. What you're looking at is the prototype of all mad scientist scenes, and still one of the finest. Who knows what all those electrical gadgets are supposed to do, but who cares? It's a dazzling display of sparks and flashing lights, crackling and buzzing and snapping and popping. Frankenstein's guests think he's out of his mind trying to reanimate a dead body, but he lets them know how serious he is with a cold stare, some stern dialogue, and the crashing of thunder to fill the background, which all complete an ominous atmosphere.
Henry, you're inhuman. You're crazy. Crazy, am I? We'll see whether I'm crazy or not.
With a bolt of lightning, Frankenstein brings the body to life and gets so excited he has to be restrained.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Surprisingly, you never see the monster get up off the table or see his face right away. Instead, you're kept in suspense. 2 scenes later, Frankenstein and Dr. Waldman are discussing the consequences. Waldman thinks he's created a monster, but Frankenstein is still confident. Then the monster finally shows up by opening a door with his back, moonwalking into the room, slowly turning, and then a series of jump cuts zoom in to his death-like face. It's a little strange, but the monster's first appearance here is savored quite nicely. The monster obeys Frankenstein's commands, and everything's under control until Fritz ruins everything. The monster gets angry and has to be confined to a prison cell located somewhere in Frankenstein's lair. Fritz harasses the monster with a whip and torch and ends up getting himself killed. It's not shown on screen, but effective just the same. They have to sedate the monster, and Frankenstein allows Waldman to kill it by dissection. But the monster wakes up, strangles him, runs away, accidentally drowns a girl in a pond, and attacks Frankenstein's wife on their wedding night. This is one thing that bears similarity to the novel. In the novel, the monster kills the wife. At the end of the film, a crowd of angry villagers with burning torches hunt the monster down. Frankenstein confronts his own creation on the top of a hill. The monster drags him to the top of a windmill, and as the tension mounts, the villagers set fire to the windmill. Frankenstein's thrown off like a rag doll, violently hitting one of the sails on his way down. The windmill goes up in flames, and the monster seemingly burns to death. It's one hell of a finale, and must have had audiences in 1931 shitting their pants. It doesn't seem like Dr. Frankenstein would have physically survived, and appropriate that he was destroyed by his own creation. Yet there's a final scene where he's recovering in bed. This ending seems real tacked on if you ask me. When the film first came out, many scenes were cut because they were too shocking back then, such as Fritz torturing the monster. A close-up of a needle going into the monster was removed, even though it was important to the plot because the needle carried a tranquilizer. Then it would seem the monster collapses with no explanation. The censors didn't care if it made sense. They took their scissors to this film without mercy. The scene with the girl was considered too disturbing, so it got cut too, even though the monster doesn't drown the girl on purpose. He thinks that she'll float like one of the dandelions. Despite being excised, it became one of the most famous scenes and imitated in Young Frankenstein. Right after the famous line where Frankenstein says it's alive, he says,
"In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God."
The censors thought this was sacrilegious, so they removed part of the line.
In the name of God, now I know what it...
Universal first released the restored version on VHS with all the missing bits intact, with the exception of the God line for some reason. But since then, on DVD, it's been fully restored. Since Universal had just completed Dracula, many of the same actors crossed over to Frankenstein. Edward Van Sloan, who played Dr. Van Helsing, is now playing Dr. Waldman.
You have created a monster and it will destroy you.
His acting is so similar, and playing another doctor on top of it makes it seem as if the same character had stepped out of one film into the next. He also gives a disclaimer at the very beginning, warning the audience that what they're about to see is really hardcore, which is pretty comical today.
So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we've warned you.
Dwight Fry had played the crazy maniac Renfield in Dracula. Now he's playing Fritz. He's much less insane here, but still offers some nutty mannerisms. We don't really know much about his character's backstory. That's what makes him interesting. He's just some weird guy who helps Frankenstein. There's a part where he's going to answer the door, and he stops for a moment to fix a sock. I don't know why, but I find that really amusing. It's not a flub, there's nothing that defies logic about a character having to fix their sock, but it's also something you don't normally see happen. Naturally, fresh off the success of Dracula, Bela Lugosi was initially chosen for the role of the monster. There seems to be many contradicting stories as to why he didn't play the monster, the most common being that Lugosi refused the role because he didn't like the idea of having his face made unrecognizable through all the makeup and not having any dialogue. And that makes perfect sense. The kind of acting he established in Dracula is completely different than the monster. Other stories say it was director James Whale who wanted Boris Karloff instead. Either way, Whale was attracted to Karloff's face when he saw him in a movie called The Criminal Code. And I think he made a great choice. There's something about Karloff's face that makes him perfect for the monster. Even though Lugosi may have said the role wouldn't take much talent other than to just stagger around and grunt, there's something about Karloff's performance that just works. At the time, he wasn't famous. In fact, he wasn't even credited at the beginning of the movie. It's just a question mark. I believe the reasoning was to make the monster seem more mysterious, but at the end, they do reveal his name. Colin Clive is the real star, playing Frankenstein. He does a great job and really makes the role convincing. Everything he says seems like he believes it 100%. What makes a good mad scientist is that they come off mad to the other characters, but the audience sympathizes with them. We sympathize with Frankenstein.
You never wanted to look beyond the clouds and the stars, or to know what causes the trees to bud, and what changes the darkness into light? But if you talk like that, people call you crazy.
It may not be a perfect film. Some of the acting is extremely exaggerated, like when Fritz is startled by a lab skeleton. The scenes that don't involve Frankenstein or the monster are kind of weak, and there are certain things that don't add up. Like, why doesn't Frankenstein realize the brain he's putting into the monster is an abnormal one? Why does Fritz have an immediate hatred for the monster even though he helped Frankenstein all along without any worry? The rest of the film is nothing short of classic. It's the archetype of its kind. It's beautiful to look at, from the cemetery scene to the laboratory to the hillside. The sound effects fill the atmosphere with constant dread. With the sounds of thunder and the yelling of villagers, you never notice the lack of music. Even if you haven't seen this movie, you may feel as if you have because of all the parodies and imitations. Go to the source, watch the one that started it all, and you'll see it lives up to what you'd expect.
Ah!